Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a British conductor who has a successful freelance career, but is probably better known as being one of the most sought-after conducting teachers in the United Kingdom. His name has appeared many times in previous episodes due to his highly successful conducting classes at both Manchester University and the Royal Northern College of Music. It is a great pleasure to welcome Mark Heron. Mark, I've known your name for many years. I'm not sure whether we've met in person or not, but it's wonderful to meet you today and to chat with you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Nice to see you.
And you. You said you've dipped in and out of a few previous episodes, so you'll probably know that I always start right back at the beginning and find out whether your parents and your family were musical and how music came into your world as a child.
Sure, sounds good. Easy answer to that. My parents weren't musical at all. Yeah. In fact, my father, who was a twin, was so appalling that when he was at primary school, I think the rule was that if the whole school was singing in assembly, him and his twin were allowed to sing, but if it was just their class, they were told they had to mime. So nobody's quite sure where if I have any talent, where that came from, but certainly wasn't my parents.
No. Interesting. I always try and find some similarities between us, but my father was a twin as well, or is a twin, should I say? They're both still alive. And so early music, I would imagine, recorder for most people in the UK is the first thing we ever get to touch and make a terrible noise on, and then went from there.
Absolutely that. My classroom teacher in primary one, Mrs. Wallace, taught us all to play the recorder, and then for some reason that nobody ever really knew, she then stayed with us in primary two. So we had 2 years of learning to play the recorder, and so by the time I was 6, I could actually read music pretty well and play, I guess, reasonably well. Then I started, I'm just going to lay out all my secrets here, Mike. Then I started violin lessons when I was 8, because that was the next available option in primary school, and kind of scraped away sort of without really ever practicing enough to become good enough. Carried on, went to secondary school, the good old days of the mid-1980s when there were such things as local authority funded music services, and the west of Scotland, where I'm from, was really an unbelievably phenomenal example of that. So, a normal comprehensive high school, we had 3 concert bands, 2 orchestras, a jazz band, 4 choirs, stuff like that. There was an incredible amount of music going on.
Wow.
But the really cool thing to be in was the concert band, not the orchestra, because they went and entered competitions and festivals and tours and all the rest of it. Yeah. So I think it was about the start of my second year, so I would have been about 13, I think. I went to the teacher who took the concert band and said, I want to play in the concert band. And he said, well, what do you want to play? And I said, I don't really care. I just want to play in the concert band. Trumpet, flute, clarinet, whatever, anything other than the violin. And he said, well, I've got enough of those, but I do need a tuba.
Wow. Yeah.
So I kind of went home on the bus with this tuba, and mother said, what is that? And what is it doing in my house? So I went from being a violinist to a tuba player, which was a bit of a jump, but something that probably has stood me in fairly good stead as a conductor, actually.
Yes, I would say so. I'm racking my brains over the previous 100 and whatever 19 or 20 episodes whether I ever interviewed a former tubist before, and I'm not sure I have. I can't. It may pop into my brain later. I'm not sure I have, but I agree with you. I mean, to be aware of, especially in a concert band where, let's face it, the tuba will be playing more often than, let's say, it does in a symphony orchestra. You're aware of, the foundation of the bass line moving, how everything sits on top of that, and how it's fundamental to how music is made.
I think so, and that was what I then went to the RNCM I progressed fairly quickly, I guess, because I just had to learn to play the instrument. I could already read music far more complex than anything I'd play on the tuba for a number of years. So after not very long, I got into the junior Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, RCMD as it was then, RCS now. So I spent my last 3 years of high school going there on Saturdays, and then went to the RNCM to study tuba, and a sort of reasonably successful career followed playing tuba, a little bit of freelancing with orchestras, mainly playing with a very good brass quintet. So kind of enough that when I then became a conductor, many people in orchestras around and about would sort of recognize me as a tuba player. So the background of fairly modest violin playing was sort of a closely guarded secret in a way. And as you know, if you can then say something that's even mildly intelligent about string playing when people recognize you as a brass player, then gosh,
yeah, absolutely, so, that's true.
Yeah, it's interesting to have both those perspectives. That's for sure.
Well, also, if you take violin playing to its extremes, you've got the very top and the very bottom of the the sound of the orchestra.
Sure.
So, at what point does the C word first enter into your life as being something you might be interested in doing, i.e., conducting?
Pretty late, actually. Certainly when I was studying, when I was doing my undergrad at the RNCM, and then the brass quintet I was playing in was pretty successful in competitions and so on, and we became chamber music fellows for a couple of years after studies and so on. And so really at that point, not at all, although I was just starting to do a little bit of conducting with I think the first thing I did was an amateur wind band, which I just saw an advert for and thought, oh, that'd be quite fun. I guess doing chamber music, you sort of, you learn to be in control of your own musical destiny in a sense. You're not just sitting there consuming other people's decisions. You learn how to rehearse, and between the 4 or 5 of you or whatever, you develop a sense of taking responsibility for your own musical decisions. So I think I at some point we were when we were doing loads of gigs, we typically do a workshop for the local brass players in the afternoon or whatever, and somebody would have to wave their arms whilst the rest of them played, and for some reason that always seemed to be me. I don't remember it being discussed, but I was sort of doing that a little bit, and then I saw an ad to do some amateur conducting, and it sort of went from there a bit. So I then, sort of very slowly just started conducting a little bit more and stopped playing quite as much.
Yeah, and you said that you freelanced a little while in orchestras. So, cliche alert, dear listener. There are certain instruments in the orchestra that have more time off than others. Let's say. Mark's nodding away. So, if you've started dipping your toes into conducting, I would imagine if you're going and playing some pro gigs and you're stood, you're sat there and there's some big name conductor stood in front of you, you're already looking down or at them and thinking, wonder why they do that. I wonder why they're doing this. Can you remember any names from those gigs that you did and that maybe inspired you or made you think, well, why does that work when I've never thought of doing that?
Yeah, I probably do. And of course, as you say, as a tuba player, you spend a lot of time observing rather than just trying to be vaguely aware of a conductor in your peripheral vision while you're playing millions of notes on the violin.
Yes.
So there was certainly quite a lot of observing. I remember, I played relatively regularly with the Halley in the kind of early mid-90s, and that was a very, very, very different Halley orchestra then than it is now.
Yes.
In all sorts of ways. So there was some gigs where you think, oh my goodness, that's sort of interesting conducting, and how does that work? I do remember once playing Alpine Symphony, playing second tuba in Alpine Symphony, and Günter Herbig was the conductor, and I think that was the first time, and I think I'd done a reasonable amount of work with the orchestra just before that, because my teacher, who was the Halley tuba player at the time, had been off for a while, and I was in quite often, and then we did this Alpine Symphony together. So I was fairly kind of used to the orchestra in a sense, and I just realized after half an hour, 45 minutes of the first rehearsal that somehow the sound of the string section had been completely transformed.
Yeah.
Without him saying or doing anything in particular, but it just sounded different and in a good way.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the one thing that sticks in my mind about that when I thought, well, gosh, there is something here that actually makes a difference and can actually have a really dramatic effect on the sound of the orchestra.
And was your conversion, is that the right word? I don't know. Your transition, let's call it a transition. from tuba player to conductor? Was it a gradual thing, or did you have I've called it a light bulb moment. Håkan Hardenberg called it the first time I took a draft of stick poison. When was it? Do you think it was a gradual progression, or did you conduct one day and think, do you know what, I really want to know more about this and I want to do more of this?
I think it was a gradual sort of deepening of curiosity and a sort of slow process from just doing those kind of hard yards of amateur orchestras and wind bands and so on and so forth, and gradually kind of working out how to do more conducting and a bit less playing and that sort of thing. So I don't think there was any one particular moment, but there came a point, I suppose, in my kind of early 30s, 32, 33 or whatever, when I suppose I sort of put the tuba away and started to really focus on conducting.
And you went back to the RNCM and did some masterclasses and studies. I mean, I've written down this, 4 names there who are pretty big names in the world of conducting. Neme and Paavo Järvi, Jorma Panala, of course, the Yoda of conducting, and Sir Mark Elder, who is somebody to this day, I would imagine you still have a relationship with what you do at the RNCM now. We will come to that much later, but sure. How are those, because I mean, I'm just looking at those 4 names, 3 at least very distinctive. You could possibly say 4 very distinctive conducting styles, even between Neme and Paavo.
Between the father and son, yeah.
How did you process what was being said to you?
Sure. I mean, I think I'd been doing some short courses, and I mean, Tim Renish was another name who probably should be in that mix, because he was the head of the School of Wind and Brass, and also the guy who looked after the junior fellow conductors at the RNCM. When I was there wasn't a master's course at that time, so I definitely kind of was influenced a lot by Tim in terms of playing while he was conducting. So I suppose because I was involved as a brass player with wind bands and so on, so Tim being such a guru in that field, the first few courses I did were with Tim. So those were the kind of first experiences I had of being taught about conducting. And then the first kind of, if you like, posh conducting masterclass that I applied to was the Järvi Academy in Estonia, which at the time was pretty new. It was maybe the 3rd year. So this was about 2003, 2004, I think. And I didn't really, I mean, I at that point, I was totally not part of the kind of young conductor circuit. I hadn't and didn't do a kind of full-time master's degree or anything. I just applied for this thing because I thought it would be quite cool, and largely because I recognized Neme's name, because growing up in Glasgow, in the late 80s, going to the Academy Junior Department, Neme Järvi was conducting the SNO on Saturday nights. So those were the first professional orchestral concerts that I ever went to as an audience member. So I kind of spotted that name and thought, oh, that's quite interesting. So I applied for it and somehow or other got in, goodness knows how. Turned up in Estonia, not that long after the demise of the Soviet times and so on. And, that was a kind of life experience in itself, sort of flying into Tallinn and working your way on the bus to this little seaside resort called Pärnu, where David Oistra had a holiday home. And there was the previous year, Neme had been doing this course, and he'd been very ill. He had a heart attack during the masterclass, was airlifted to Helsinki and operated on, blah, blah, blah. It was all very serious. Wow. And the organizers had called Jorma just to see if he happened to be at home. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll be there tomorrow. So he'd kind of come in and sort of saved the week. And then that following year, when I was there, that was the first time that Paavo was there with Neme, and they also invited Jorma because they felt that they should thank him for helping out the year before. So we had this incredible 3-week masterclass with 4 different orchestras, at least 5 different programs being taught every day by Neme, Paavo, and Jorma. And I mean, I was so incredibly fortunate when I look back on it now to have had that experience, and that really. Those 3 weeks were what formed my ideas about what conducting is, and also how it can be taught.
Yes.
quite, as you say, so incredibly different. Jorma, and then I then went back to Estonia a few times after that. I did some other master classes with Jorma in other places. So you go from Jorma, who's incredibly practical. It's all about just one goes down, the upbeat goes up, downbeat goes down. Don't confuse the orchestra. Very incredibly practical. All about the knowledge of the score. You had Nemi, who was this sort of kind of old school Russian training. He studied in Moscow with Rabinovich and people like this, and had this unbelievable ability to control an orchestra by doing almost nothing. And then you had Pavel, who had obviously had his father's influence, but had also because when they emigrated, defected to the West, and then ended up in the US. So I think Pavel was something like 15 or 16 when they left Estonia. So his kind of education as a student was in the US. So he had this influence from there, and he also had this wonderful ability to come up to you and say, "Oh yeah, do you know when my father was saying or showing you this earlier on, what he really meant was this." He could kind of translate what his father was trying to say. So that was an extraordinary time, really, and probably the most important influence on me in everything that I do now, I think.
Well, I mean, I've spent, similar to you, 2 or 3 weeks with Jorma Pandler in St. Petersburg, and was lucky enough to count those as very formative experiences. On the recommendation of Sakari Ormo, who said, "Look, you can conduct, but you don't really know. It's time to stop the arms and legs thrashing around like a speared octopus and try and contain it all." What's interesting about what you did there was that you've got probably 3 different styles, and it almost forces you to take what you can from one and apply it to you, and see how it is affected by another and applied to you. And so you're already having to think about your own body and the consequences of what you do with your hands and arms. From the simplicity of Jorma, as you said, it is very practical, isn't it? One goes down. Make sure your cross beats are clear, because the people to the sides of the stage need to see your cross beats. All of those things. Don't bend your knees. Don't bounce up and down. Then you're then building layers on top of that, aren't you? It's interesting. Before we go on, or before you answer that, you made me think of Paavo had influences from his father. When I studied with Jorma, I was there with Ken David Mazur, who's now got a very flourishing career in the States, son of Kurt. The first time he conducted, all of us conductors looked at each other in the auditorium and said, "It's just like his father." There were so many mannerisms. I bet you he didn't even think about it. But it was very, very, very clear who his father was. It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you could probably, I don't know, I think with Nemi and Parvo, you probably have to look beneath the surface a bit to see the connections. Because they are, in a way, they are quite different. But I mean, what one particular moment that I remember from that first time there was Brahms' second movement of Brahms 1, with a professional orchestra, the local professional orchestra, and I sort of started off, and after 4 or 5 measures or something, I sort of felt this presence behind me. These 2 arms came round and took hold of my hands, and it was Nemi. And he just proceeded to, and I thought, I'm not quite sure what I'm meant to do here, but I'll just go with the flow, and he went all the way to the end of that movement, without saying anything, and just basically just took control of my hands and my arms, and I was just standing there thinking, oh my gosh, you can actually control an orchestra by doing that much, by doing that little. So that's sort of kind of extreme example, and I would never, I don't think I'd ever do that myself in my own teaching, but as an example of what's possible, that was kind of quite extraordinary way of just showing the possibilities and experiencing that. And then, as you say, Jorma was totally practical, and Pavel was sort of somehow different again, and brought in all his ideas of the work that he did with still does in Bremen with the Deutsche Kammerfamilie and the historically informed influence together with modern instruments and all that kind of stuff. So it was a very sort of heady mix. And when I tell people about it now, that maybe a lot of I always of course recommend to my students that they go and apply for that masterclass. And when I tell them what it was like in those days, they're like, "Oh my god!" It's not quite as fortunate in just in that kind of mix of people now, but it was a great experience.
I applied and didn't get in. I wanted to go as well. I never went. I'm going to chuck in another name, and on the surface at least, his conducting style seems quite different from Jorma and the Järvis, and that's Sir Colin Davis. And you went on the mentoring scheme with the London, or mentoring program with the London Symphony Orchestra and Sir Colin Davis.
Mm.
And I know from previous people I've spoken to that he very sort of thinking style of teaching, or not even teaching, but sort of mentoring and commenting. And how was he? Did he get involved with technique, or was it much more to do with the mentorship and the thinking about the music and the approach to conducting?
It was a bit more of the latter, a bit more of the mentoring, and that was again, that's a scheme that's changed very much from those days, 2006 or something, whenever that was. But in at the time, it was a couple of sessions conducting the orchestra, which of course is amazing to conduct the LSO, and then a lot of rehearsal visits. And it was just at the time when Colin was finishing and Gergiev was starting, so there was kind of contact with the two of them and the opportunity to watch both of them working in their extremely contrasting ways. But yeah, I mean, he was incredibly generous and very, very positive and very lovely, of course, but also very, very questioning, and very, would ask what on the surface would appear to be a quite a kind of gentle question, but then you realize that he's actually challenging your decisions and what he's just seen you do incredibly carefully. I think the thing that I remember about that most of all was the first session with the orchestra. It was a kind of public masterclass type thing, and it was Leonora number 3, and I kind of looked up and saw Rod Franks sitting in the first trumpet chair and thought, oh, well, it's not Maurice Murphy, but never mind, that's pretty cool. And then of course the offstage trumpet starts, and it's like, that's Maurice.
That's Maurice.
So as a kind of brass geek conducting. Rod Franks playing first trumpet and Maurice playing off stage in Leonora was quite fun.
That's amazing. You would definitely be a brass geek to spot it's Maurice Murphy's. I'd have spotted it as well.
exactly. But I think at that stage when I was I was quite young and I was kind of just beginning really as a conductor. The biggest thing that I took from that experience was that even when you're conducting an orchestra like the LSO, in relatively standard repertoire, there was still things in my mind that I wanted to say, and that gave me a huge amount of confidence, because that's a really difficult thing for a young conductor, isn't it? What happens if I stand up there in front of a great orchestra and I don't have anything to say? So I think I got a lot of confidence from the fact that even though it was the LSO and by far the greatest orchestra I'd conducted at that point, there was still things that I was kind of hearing or noticing and wanting to change or adjust, and not absolutely everything was perfect the first time through. Most of it was, but not absolutely everything. So that was nice actually.
Yeah, no, it's true. I remember Andres Nelson saying to me when he'd been to, I think he'd been there for the first time to Berlin Philharmonic, and he said, the most important thing is that you've got to go in with ideas, and you've got to go in and you've got to be ready to work and to challenge them. Yeah, they may be considered the greatest orchestra on the planet, but they want to work and they want to hear your ideas, and they've booked you because they want to hear your musical ideas, and that's really important. And as you said, I've stood in front of, 40 professional orchestras, 35, 40, and as you say, nothing is perfect the first time through, and there will be corners they really need your help to rehearse them, and there will be moments when their default way of playing it is the opposite to how you want it to be. And that's the whole point. As long as you listen hard enough to what's coming back at you and how that is interacting with you, well, then there's always something you can say and there's always somewhere you can go with it. And that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I remember one very famous conductor, I will not mention who it is, when I was playing in the CBSO, who was rather young. I'm sure I overheard him after we'd played through a great piece of standard repertoire that the CBSO could play backwards. He turned to the leader and said, "What do I do now?" And I remember thinking, it's a good job that I'm sitting near the front and only a few of us heard you say that. Excuse me.
You finish early.
Yeah, exactly. You finish. Yeah, send us home early. We can be on the golf course by 2:30. Yeah,
Absolutely. So I think, in those kind of studying period, if you like, learning period, those names were hugely influential. And then, as I started to be more involved at the RNCM with conducting projects and teaching, of course, Sir Mark has been a huge figure in that. And when you sit there realizing that it's part of your job to sit and watch while he talks through a score of Elgar 1 or teaches a class or works with the orchestra or something, then it's like, well, I'm being paid to do this. This is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So his I mean, I think what I took most, or what I still do take so much with Mark is it's just the importance of the quality of your ear. And when he talks about how every day he tries to make his ear a little bit better than it was the day before, then well into his 70s, that's an impressive thing to aspire to.
Teaching is one question in a way. I want to hover on guest conducting, and because it's something I would imagine you also have to teach to your students about. So I'm going to sort of link the two in. I mean, often when we first make our tentative steps out into our conducting careers, at whatever stage of our life, I was well into my 30s when it sort of started to happen. Others are doing it in their early 20s, and you've been teaching them and mentoring them at that point. We don't get a choice of what we conduct when we go and guest conduct, but we all stand in front of that orchestra, whoever it might be, on a Monday morning and put a beat down and have no idea when it's going to come back, the sound or how they're going to respond to you. So, I mean, in those early days when you were going and guest conducting, did you have any strategies for coping with that? And then are there any that you pass on to your students now to say, be aware of this? Try not to do that. Try not to say this too soon, or what sort of things can you pass on from your own experiences?
Sure. I think one of the things that I've become increasingly aware of is how incredibly different that is in different countries of the world.
Absolutely,
the culture difference between working with a British professional orchestra and a German professional orchestra is really vast, actually.
Yeah.
And as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a moment, our class is extremely international, and that's one of the very kind of interesting things is kind of comparing and contrasting and thinking about all those different cultures. But certainly, if one's talking about British orchestras, then of course it's keep your mouth shut and conduct.
Yeah, so true.
Don't stop too early. Play and think while you're playing. I think I probably talk quite a lot to them on a kind of first date, if you like, about finding a balance between. Of course, you can't conduct as if it's the concert on Monday morning, because they'll just say, "Why are you conducting like it's a concert? It's Monday morning." On the other hand, if you're too neutral and too calm, then they'll just think you're boring. So how do you? And this is probably quite repertoire dependent, but I think I've often heard feedback from orchestras saying, "Oh, if only we knew that the conductor was that interesting, we'd have tried a bit harder." But he or she didn't show us that until the gig.
So
I think that's one of the big differences between going somewhere for the first time and going back when there's an established relationship. When you've had a couple of successful events and they ask you back, you can kind of go into work mode and be quite neutral and quite calm, and they know that it's going to be good in the concert. If it's the first time, at some point fairly near the start of the process, you probably need to show them a little sense of what you can do when it comes to it, without going kind of full on concert mode. So I think that's probably one thing that we do kind of quite regularly talk about. I also try to encourage them to find, it's such an international world that we live in, where we're all so connected with each other. Everybody probably is only a couple of Facebook friends away from somebody in every orchestra. So trying to find out a little bit about that orchestra and how they like to work, and whether they're in a good place or not. A bit sort of background research as to how they like to work is quite important. But yeah, probably those would be the main things.
very interesting you talking about, and I'm going to take it back a couple of questions or a few comments ago about how much to conduct or to show, or in that first instance. I remember when Sakari Oromo left the CBSO in 2008. By then, he'd made me assistant conductor, and we had a very good relationship as friends. And I had a burning question I had to ask him, and I took him out for a pint, and we sat down, and then I said, I've got this one question. I said, Jorma teaches you to conduct. He prefers you with no baton. The famous comment, why have one baton when I have 10 batons? Yet, if I list all of his great pupils who've made it, Mika Frank, Hannah Lintu, Susanna Malky, you, Yokope, or you all have a baton, normally quite long, and you all have quite a large florid beat. Why? And he said, in the end, I think we probably all realized that in those first 5 minutes to 30 minutes with an orchestra, you have to show something of yourself. And just doing the simple things of down, across, up, with simple up and down gestures with the left hand doesn't do it. And so whilst we have those abilities in our bodies to do that clarity, you have to show something of yourself at the start of a guest conducting period when you go for the first time on a blind date or on a first date. And I think that's so true that, whilst, you don't want to be conducting full-on concert mode on a Monday morning, but if you just sit there and just put the beats down and then turn it on in the show, they think, well, he was lazy for 2 days. Why did he do that? And then suddenly turn it on in the concert and expect us to, I think if you have to give something of yourself for them to give something of themselves back in the rehearsal process.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's one of the, there are many, one of the things that we talk about a lot with the students is the difference between conducting amateurs and students and youth groups and professional groups. Because of course you can only really learn what it is to conduct a professional orchestra by conducting a professional orchestra. And if you're conducting a youth orchestra, an amateur orchestra, generally speaking, everybody's there because they want to be, and they're having quite a good time, hopefully. And it is possible that there's more energy coming from the players than there is from the conductor. Whereas, of course, in a professional situation, that will never be the case, and professional players will never give more energy than the conductor is. And of course, that can be quite hard if you're putting it out there, even at kind of 85%, if not 95% in a rehearsal, and there's nothing coming back at you, and sort of learning to deal with that, I think is an important thing. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You have to do something. But I think one of Jorma's sort of geniuses in a sense, and something that I really try to carry through is, I always felt with Jorma that he would, particularly once I'd worked with him a little bit, and maybe I was at a masterclass somewhere, and there was somebody there for the first time, he would, his first sort of thing, his first way of testing somebody out would be to tell them a couple of things that he felt they should stop doing.
Yes.
And then if they could come back the next day showing that they were able to get rid of something, bendy knees or whatever it might be, then he would start to get a little bit interested, and he would start to give things. So I think that process of cleaning everything away and making it kind of super minimal and super efficient and very clear and so on is a sort of creating a situation from which the individual can then grow.
That is so true.
Rather than sort of just allowing what's there naturally to continue, I think. So yeah, I think I'd probably do that as well.
It's so true. It's exactly the reason why Sakari sent me to him. Because I will openly say I was like a speared octopus. There were tentacles and arms going in all directions. And during that time with Jorma, he did. I remember the first thing I started to conduct was the third movement of Shostakovich 1, a beautiful oboe solo, very, very quiet. And I gave this big upbeat. Said, no, smaller, smaller, smaller. And of course, the next time I came back, it was smaller again. No, smaller, smaller. And then I remember, I had a tendency to sort of walk around the podium a bit, to walk to the first and then walk across the cellos. And that stopped in one instance where there was a few Finnish curse words shouted from the audience, and then I felt the podium I stood on lifted up by him, and he just screamed at me, "Stand still!" But you're right. If you took on board what he said and the things not to do, and started cleaning them up, then he would really help you, because he knew that you were interested in what he was saying. And I came away from there much more minimalist. But then from then, around the same time, Andros Nelson's walked into the CBSO and I was still playing. I then started to think, well, I've got this. I can do the Yorma stuff now, but now I need to add some other thing. I need to add some more emotion. Maybe not quite as much as the young Andros Nelsons, but yeah, you're so right. It's absolutely right what you say. That it's a paring back and make it. You've then got a technique that you can resort to when you need clarity or when the shit hits the fan and the orchestra's wobbling like hell, and you just need to put down a clear 4 and a bar and show them when it's needed. And
absolutely, and of course, a lot of that is repertoire dependent as well. And I've always done a lot of new music, often fairly complex new music, and that's a completely different thing from conducting Brahms or whatever with a professional orchestra. So yeah, and the other thing that I would say about Jorma that I used to love doing, or maybe get the most from, because he would often, if he could, he would position himself in the orchestra, wouldn't he?
That's right.
Back of the seconds or something, between the seconds and the winds. And I can't remember whether I just worked this out for myself or somebody gave me a tip off, but go and sit beside him was the advice. Because if you sit beside him, and of course he's sitting there without a score, because everything is just in the mind, and you would get this kind of running commentary of what was about to happen in a bar or 2 bars time. Of it, okay, soon, 4th horn, sharp. Okay, violas will be late, and you would just get this kind of live description of the problems of conducting a piece, and sort of scribbling everything down, because his, when it was repertoire that he really knew, he was sort of so kind of encyclopedic with his knowledge of it, and so experienced at seeing it that he just knew what was going to happen before it happened. 9.5 times out of 10. Wow. And from that, I sort of took and really tried to develop this idea that, as conductors, one of the things that we should be trying to do is prevent something happening that we know is probably going to happen. And as I say to my students often, nobody's going to come up to you at the break and say, "Oh, the way you stopped the horns being late there was just absolutely brilliant." But what it does is create you more time, because if your technique is able to, if your knowledge of the score and craft of the orchestra and your technique is able to prevent something going wrong, then of course that means you don't have to stop and talk about it, and that just buys you more time. And to me, that's what conducting technique is.
So true, and the perfect link into what RNCM, Manchester University, and also the RAF. I read as well. You go in and conduct there. So you've just explained, if we can, as conductors, nip things in the bud before they become habitual problems, and by something we do with our technique. But what other things are you hot on? Shall we say? If you look back at, I've asked various Musian people, it's very much about stick technique. Of course, the famous Hans Swarovski, he did about 15 minutes tops on technique, and everything was about score study. So how would you consider what you do? Are you overall holistic approach? And what's an average week like for your students in Manchester? Piano classes, quartets, what do they get up to?
Sure. I think in terms of what I'm kind of hot on is it is technique in a sense, but it's not technique as in this is how you conduct, and it's not sort of, oh, I teach the blah 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 technique. I mean, I don't buy into that at all, because I think every individual is unique, and why should somebody who's 19 years old, female, and 2 meters tall conduct the same way as a short old man in their 80s?
Exactly. Yeah.
It just doesn't. If you're talking about playing the cello or the violin or the piano or whatever, there's a common factor. So you can have a school of piano playing or a school of cello playing or whatever, because there's something that unifies everybody. But with conducting, it's not really like that. So I think it's. There are certain very practical things that we always talk about. We always have, at the point we're speaking, we're kind of, I think, 6 weeks into the new academic year, and the majority of our students are on a 2-year master's program. And we have a class of 12, so 1 fellow and 11 or 12 master students. So 5 or 6 who have just been with us for 6 weeks. And we always, as always, in the last few weeks, we've always had the how to beat in two discussion, as in make sure that the orchestra can tell the difference between one and two instead of a bouncy one which only leaves you the option to do a two that's exactly the same. So there are certain very practical things like that come up repeatedly. I think we also work quite a lot on this sense of, when you're conducting it in a class situation, which might be with two pianos or with string quartet and piano or whatever, a small ensemble, you've got to be realistic to the number of people that are there. And then when you stand in front of an orchestra of 80, you've got to be more energetic. You've got to do more to command the room. So I think for me, the sort of the smaller gestures, the focusing, the don't thrash around too big sort of thing is important in that situation where you've maybe got 7 or 8 musicians in front of you, because then when you have 80 in front of you, well, you actually should do more. So it's a kind of relative energy type thing, I suppose. But then a lot of it is incredibly practical. We make the students do as wide a variety of repertoire as humanly possible. If they're a string player, more than likely the first thing we'll do is throw them in front of a brass band or a wind band. If they're a formerly professional horn player, then they'll probably do some string orchestra stuff or something. So there's that kind of thing. Tons of new music, opera, stuff with the session orchestra, as wide a variety of things as possible, in the hope that whichever door happens to open for you, you're in a position to be able to walk through it, because your chances of doing a Brahms cycle in the first few years of your career with a professional orchestra are pretty small.
Yes.
So in terms of what a typical week looks like, for us, there's no such thing, because every week is totally different. The things that are relatively constant are we generally have 2 classes a week, Monday and Wednesday mornings, and usually one of those will be with string quintet and 2 pianos, and the other one will be with 2 pianos. We have, people are divided on how useful piano classes are.
It was going to be one of my questions, because I've said it so many times. There's a rattle quote about, if you want to conduct, conducting 2 pianos is only very good if you're going to conduct 2 pianos. But listening to what you've said, and also chatting, as I often did, to Alpesh Chauhan, who studied with you in Manchester, he said, and I talked to him about the 2 piano classes, not on the podcast, just personally. He said, I would use it for a specific technical thing, or a tiny technical thing, knowing that I'm not going to get the response back of the string section that I'm going to get when I conduct a professional orchestra, or when I conduct, another orchestra. And so it's a way of focusing, isn't it, on something specific.
It is. And Alpesh is someone I often mention in connection with piano classes, because he was the great thing about Alpesh was that he was basically pretty rubbish when he was conducting 2 pianos.
he admitted the same to me.
And then when he stood in front of the orchestra, he came to life. And of course, that's the right way round. The other way around is not so good. And that can be, something I'm very aware of as a teacher is the sort of the domain of the 2 piano class can become the kind of performance output for the teacher sort of thing, and it can get a bit kind of a bit irrelevant in a sense. But what when we're doing, that's why we try really to have at least 1 class a week with strings, because that makes a big difference. And we're working as much as possible with professionals. So when we have 2 piano classes, it's colleagues, it's not the students having to play for themselves. And our A team, if you like, are 2 unbelievable musicians called Ben Powell and Harvey Davis, who have been kind of around the RNCM for many, many years. And they've both been playing in our classes for about 12 or 15 years, so they're actually incredibly experienced.
They know how to react to a beat.
They know how to react, and to the point that if we're doing Chike 5 and the slow movement and the conductor doesn't cue the horn, then they just don't play the horn. So and you can say
good on them. Yeah,
you can say, okay, guys, let's just in a slow Brahms or something. Yeah, just let's just play behind the beat, shall we? And they go Halle or BBC Phil, and they'll kind of shift as to how far behind mind, and they can play anything. I mean, Anthony Hermes is with us this week doing a project with the orchestra. So he did a class this morning on Zarathustra. And Ben and Harvey were playing, and Anthony nicknamed them the two beasts because they are so good and so responsive. So in that context, it's useful. But whether it's them or strings, it's hardly ever that we're doing a piece just for the sake of doing a piece. We're doing a piece because somebody is doing it. So it's preparation for a session with the orchestra the following week, or it's preparation for someone doing a competition or whatever. So it's always leading to something. It's not in isolation. So those are the kind of things that are relatively structured in a sense. And then the students do a lot of conducting. We have a certain number of days in the year which we call repertoire orchestra, which is partly about the student players learning core repertoire, because of course in conservatoire land, the RNCM or the Royal College or Birmingham or whatever, symphony orchestra, you would unlikely to do Dvorak 8 in a college orchestra project. Do this week they're doing Mahler 10, for example. That's the sort of thing you might do, Shostakovich 8 or whatever. So we use those sessions as a way of just giving the students experience of playing that repertoire. Student conductors conducting those, so it will be a 6-hour day with an informal concert at the end. We generally use a professional leader for those. We have a wind tutor in the room, so it's a very kind of holistic learning type thing. And Lynn Fletcher or whichever wind tutor is involved is feeding back to the conductors as well as me. So it's all geared towards not being too kind of conductor geeky. Our basic model at the RNCM is that every performance project that happens, and we do a lot, is that myself or a colleague or a guest will be conducting the project, and there will be one or sometimes two students on that project conducting a piece. So the project tomorrow night with Anthony is Mahler 10, and our junior fellow will conduct a short piece at the beginning of the concert before that. That's our absolutely typical model. So they're actually, and that's all about giving them the actual experience of rehearsing towards a performance. And in a way, that doesn't matter whether it's a brass band or a wind octet or a cello trio or a new music project or a symphony orchestra or an opera scene or whatever. It's that sort of learning how to work kind of thing, which probably, if you think about the sort of feedback that I get from players, about young conductors, they say, well, the thing about your students is that they know how to rehearse, whereas a lot of people who've been through conducting programs, maybe very, very good ones, and they're very talented, and maybe they win a competition, but then they don't actually know what to do for 3 days.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I can, from what you described and what I know also from anecdotally from Alpesh, I can see why it's considered, and I do consider it. And when people ask me where should I go and study, I always say RNCM first. End of argument. I've also worked in Glasgow at the RCS, and I know that their course is really improving, and I've really enjoyed teaching them as well. But it sounds like your conductors have the possibilities to try an awful lot of things. And just anecdotally to you, when Jonathan Bloxham became the assistant conductor of the CBSO, I was on the panel, and I sifted through 201 applications. I never ever looked at the CV first. I looked at the videos first. And I think I spotted 90% of the people who came from RNCM because they just look sorted. They look really sorted technically. They weren't all the same by any stretch.
Yep.
They look sorted and comfortable in their bodies, and I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm going. I'd see a name and think, maybe that's an RNCM name, and I think I got it right often.
I think that's kind of you to say so, and I think that's often the case, and I would be appalled to think that anybody would say, "Oh, I recognize that as one of your students because of how they conduct."
No, not so. Yeah, exactly.
I recognize that as one of your students because they know how to rehearse. Then that's
absolutely
that's fine. And we're fortunate that we have a great relationship with the local orchestras. That's one of the advantages of not being in London, of course. In Birmingham there's CBSO and Conservatoire, but here we're even luckier than that because we have Halley, BBC, Camerata, RLPO just down the road, Opera North the other way. So we have we have a formal relationship with the BBC and RLPO to provide them with assistant conductors, because neither of those orchestras have a permanent assistant in the way that CBSO or Halley do.
I've benefited from them with both the BBC Philharmonic and Liverpool. I've had one of your guys there, and it really helps, to have somebody in there. And also, it's just nice to chat about conducting with a young conductor. And they want to pick your brains, but also, I want to hear from them what they think the orchestra sounds like, and is there anything you would do differently? And just have a chat about things. It's good to be open.
And that sort of career side of thing and learning how to network and so on is also hugely important. I mean, when I saw the new first years in the first couple of weeks of term for a one-to-one session, they come in clutching the scores that they know they're doing in the next few days, and it's like, no, that's for another day. The first question I ask is, what do you think? What do you want to be doing in 20 months' time when you walk out of the door here? Because now is the time to start thinking about that. So the kind of career planning and progression, and talking to them about agents and working out how to network, and that's a great thing about the assisting. It's sort of sometimes some conductors use assistants more than others, and sometimes they get to kind of stand up and conduct for 10 minutes of this time, and sometimes they don't. Whatever, actually the most important thing is getting to know people, and then perhaps going out for dinner after the concert with the manager and the agent and the soloists and whatever, and lots of, over the years, things have happened from that. That a relationship has built up between a conductor and a student, and then once they graduate, they go and assist them somewhere else, and then that orchestra will give them a concert or whatever, give them a schools concert. All that side of stuff is incredibly important as well.
I have two more things about teaching before we get to the ever important 10 questions, Mark, as I'm sure you know. One of them, in Birmingham, I sort of, with their master's program, I talked to the young conductors, and I've been dealing with two this week, because I've got a concert tomorrow night in Birmingham at the Conservatoire. And funnily enough, it isn't standard repertoire, as it never is. And the students have asked me, when can we do a Beethoven symphony, Mike? When can we do a Brahms? Tomorrow we're doing Bernstein, Carl Withen, and a Erilyn Wallen piano concerto world premiere. Just one of them things. But with the students in Birmingham, I have got involved with more of the practical things, like you just said, networking. They've asked me there, could you take them through some things like how to organize a rehearsal order? Or when you're offered your first date and you're given the symphony and the concerto and you need to find a 20-minute opener, or we want to do this concerto, build a program around it. Or, the one I do, and I've almost like a lecture on it now, is a John Williams night, and you've got one day of 6 hours rehearsal, and then the dress, and then you've got the other option, which is the RPO, all done on 3 hours, and see you tonight for the show. That sort of thing. I'm assuming you do those. People would think, well, it's a very boring thing to talk about, but actually, in our world, they're really important things to talk about.
Absolutely, and that stretches from. One of the first projects that 3 of the first years did this year was what we call our Young Explorers concerts, which is family concerts that we do in the RNCM. So they had a not quite a Liverpool or CBSO rehearsal schedule, but something not far away from it, and they had to do the whole scheduling thing, and they had to work with the presenter and all that kind of thing. Those are the real world experiences. But we have talks with people like Simon Webb from BBC Phil. We have programming sessions. I mean, Mike George from BBC is a great guy for a kind of programming session.
Is he ever? Yeah.
He just says, okay, and he just says a piece and says, all right, then what you going to do with this? And how can you program around that? Or why is this a terrible program? And he gives you 3 incredibly obscure pieces that are all in C major or something like that. Because his sort of knowledge. But all of that stuff is incredibly important, and they have to, and they, we also. One of the other things we do is farm them out to the many local amateur orchestras, and that's also just really good in terms of, and the secretary of whatever local orchestra is like, oh well, do you want me to copy you in and everything? No, this is about them learning just to deal with you, and for you to get pissed off with them if they don't answer your emails.
Exactly.
And no, you can't change the rehearsal schedule. And I'm sorry, do you realize that you've put the only piece with the trombones in it in the wrong part of the day or whatever? All this kind of stuff. So yeah, all of that is super, super, super important, and that's also something that they learn through these assistantships with the BBC and Liverpool, because they, one of the things we encourage them is of course not just to be with the conductor, also to talk to the players, but also to get to know the management, and especially in the case of the BBC, because they do their final exams with the BBC Philharmonic, lucky them, that when they then stand up in front of that orchestra and the orchestral manager walks in and so on, it's not the first time they've met them, and that that makes a big difference when they're in that situation. It's great when the players will wander over to them at the break and say, "See what that conductor did then? Never do that." or more recently, I think just before the summer, Andrew Davis was at the Beeb, and at the first break, about 5 of the players went over to the assistants and said, "See what he did there? That's what you do."
Yeah, exactly.
Say good morning, conduct through, say 2 things, play most of it again. Thanks very much, everyone. Let's go into the next piece.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you hear it from players who've been there 25 years, it means something. Absolutely. I've said it before. It's a great thing about being an assistant. Get in the TQ. Go and buy somebody a pint afterwards. Ask why that sentence pissed you off, or why the orchestra sounds different this week because better than it was last time you were in. And find out. So the players will tell you. It's not a secret. They're happy to talk about it because they love their orchestra.
They do, and also what's been really nice to see over the 7 or 8 years that we've had this kind of more stronger relationship with them, which, huge credit to Simon Webb for instigating a lot of that, is that, an orchestra which maybe had a bit of a reputation for being quite tough on young conductors coming into work with them, usually justifiably so. Now that, because they're a little bit more a part of a process and a little bit more involved in it, and they are also used to seeing situations where myself or my colleague Clark Wandell are there with the students, and helping them a little bit in front of the orchestra and so on, and they see problems being solved and things getting better, and they then start to buy into that, and they start to welcome that, and they start to see the importance of that, rather than the typical situation of which happens so often with BBC orchestras, of course, because they have so many short patches of work which doesn't result in a public concert, of some agency just trying out a young conductor on an orchestra, and everybody knowing from the first minute that it's going to be a disaster. But and then understandably the players don't particularly enjoy that. So yeah, it's great to see their generosity and their investment in the process of helping them.
Also, because unless they did as you and I did, went and studied, or put ourselves in masterclasses, what we do sometimes can be a bit of a mystery. And if the layers are peeled back and players realise, oh, actually conducting is quite hard, and see what difference that simple piece of body language had upon what I did, then they become more interested when a great comes in, and they could go, my God, they're doing, and then when there's a young kid comes in, as you said, an agency's pushed in front, and they can look up and see, I know why I'm not playing well because of that. It's not just a beauty contest, which, often before the layers are peeled back, it is a beauty contest. People just shouting, oh, I think he's crap, or she's awful, or whatever. I've never met an orchestra that isn't interested. I did something during lockdown with the CBSO. It was an online thing on Facebook, and I did basically took apart the first 120 bars of Beethoven 5 and talked about how every beat mattered and what it did if you didn't, conducted it one way and then the other. And you could see players looking at each other going, I've never thought about that. They just sit there and play the notes. I mean, orchestras benefit.
Many situations where I've been sort of teaching a masterclass with a professional orchestra or whatever, and then somebody will come up to you at the break and say, can I give you a list of conductors? You should say all those things to me. But I think you're right, because professional players, assuming they've not perhaps dug into conducting very deeply, they'll always know if something's not working.
Yeah.
And as I often say to the students, you should absolutely go with that instinct, because that will be almost always totally correct.
Yeah.
What they then give you as their suggested solution may not necessarily be.
That's also very true. Yeah.
But with a bit of awareness and a bit of involvement in the process, then everyone becomes a little bit more aware of how to make it better, hopefully. So yeah. That's the most important thing, is that the orchestra plays well.
Yes, absolutely. I was teaching somebody today, and I said, everything you do, it's 100% for the orchestra to play well. Absolutely everything you do. If as a byproduct, it means that some people in the audience who are watching what you do are interested by it, great. But that is a byproduct only. It's 100% for the orchestra. Yeah. There's an 11th question, which every conductor has answered. And I wonder whether you apply your thoughts on this to your students, or whether you leave them, much as you do with their body shape and how they are formed, to leave them to their own devices. When you come to learn a new score, and you said it, and you've done quite a lot of contemporary music as well, how do you go about doing it? Do you sit with your inner ear? Do you ever use the piano? And are you a scribbler inner of things? I am very much a scribbler in. I'm a red, blue, black person, and I've got my own system of doing it. How do you do it, Mark? And because of your wonderful teaching, do you suggest a system of marking in to your students, or do you just leave them to do their own thing?
Okay, so I probably am a scribbler, although not as much of a scribbler as I used to be.
Yeah, I think we're all a bit like that. Yeah,
definitely one of those people that you take something off the shelf that you haven't looked at for 15 years, and you open up and you think, oh my god. So yeah, I do like to make markings. I think I'm probably now much better at that, and in that I try to only mark things that I want to notice when I'm actually standing there conducting. Particularly, of course, if it's new music, then some sort of system for all the meters and so on is important. And I do kind of teach that, the sort of a process of marking up an incredibly complicated contemporary score that's changing meter all the time. How do I go about it? I'm a dreadful piano player, so that's rarely a thing that I do. Occasionally I might just try a few chords or whatever. I tend to just, I do listen to recordings. I think anybody who says that they don't is a liar. I try to listen to recordings, in an ideal situation. I try to listen to recordings really at the very beginning of the process and then stop. I absolutely try to listen to some recordings that I think I might not like. But certainly a variety. So I do that. I absolutely don't sit and conduct along to the recording. I think that's really not a good idea. And one sees that. Great friend and colleague Nicholas Pasquet, the conducting teacher in Weimar, he just goes, YouTube conducting. Because of course you can spot it straight away.
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah.
And I think for me, because I do. I don't conduct as much now because I'm teaching so much more. I still conduct quite a lot, but if you go back 5 or 6 years, I was conducting really a lot, and very often, with also several things overlapping at the same time, and some short professional type projects within 3 days, and some things that were spread over 2 weeks or longer or whatever. So I very often had really a lot of scores on the go at the one time. So for me, what was very important was having a process which just starts big and goes small, so that you can, if you've got 6 months to study something, or you've got 6 minutes to study something, you can still manage. So starting with the going through the whole piece really quite quickly, and doing the bare minimum to mean that you can get away with it if that's what you have to do, and then carry on going more and more and more. So I think that's probably the main thing I would say. I sometimes you have quite involved conversations with students about that, but I think by the time somebody gets the level of getting into our course, then they sort of know that already in a way. So it's not often, probably, to be honest, not something we often talk about, actually.
Yeah. At this point, I asked Mark his views on whether it was necessary to be a good pianist to become a great conductor. This was a question I felt needed answering after discussing it in episode 80 with George Jackson, and with another conducting teacher whose episode I have yet to release. You can hear this short discussion on my Patreon page as a bonus mini episode. As well as these bonus mini-episodes, you will find interviews, articles, discussion topics, and that it is a great place to discover much more about what a conductor does. All of this can be found at patreon.com/a mic on the podium. And from just £5 a month, you can gain access to this ever-growing resource on conductors and conducting. That's patreon.com. Details and links to the page are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, the all-important 10 questions with my guest, Mark Heron. Mark, it is unavoidable. It is the 10 questions which every conductor has answered since episode 2. Well, in fact, I even answered them in episode 1, so there we go. And I always start with, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
Sound I love would be probably the sea. Sound I hate, probably I'm going to say Boris Johnson's voice.
Brilliant. First person to mention Boris Johnson. I did have Donald. No, I lie. She didn't say, Holly Matheson didn't say Donald Trump. She said the sound of American politics, which is a very good cop-out, but I know what she meant. Brilliant answer. If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
Probably playing golf.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. Are you good?
I'm not bad. Yeah.
I
I think 10. So. Yeah.
Oh, well, I know you are good, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I think you and Michael Francis have given the same answer. The ex-bass player, LSO bass player. I gave up golf when I started playing cricket again because I promised my wife that I would do one all-day sport, not 2 in a week. So until I give up cricket, I won't go back to golf. But I used to love it. I used to love the walking. The frustration of how bad I wasn't good, but. What a great way to spend a day.
It's the ideal sport for our lifestyle, isn't it? Because you can go and play whenever you're free.
Absolutely. Question number 4: who would be your favourite conductor or conductors of yesteryear?
I think because I'm always just so impressed by conductors that are admired by orchestras, so I'm probably going to go Maris Janssens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think most orchestras absolutely loved him. Very, very good choice. Question 5 is considered harder by some conductors. Others haven't found it hard at all. And question 5 is, who would be your favourite current conductor or conductors? And other people have gone repertoire specific on this if you wish to.
Yeah, I think it really is repertoire specific for me. There are certain conductors that I would admire in some music that I wouldn't even bother bringing up on YouTube for other pieces. But probably just because he was such an influence on me when I was starting out, I'd probably say Pavel Järvi.
What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
Probably a few things for different reasons. In a kind of difficulty, just complexity sense. Piece by English composer called Philip Grange, who used to be the head of composition at Manchester University. He was a student and disciple of Max.
Right.
And he a piece called The Kingdom of Bones, which was unbelievably difficult. That was fun. I enjoyed that. From a kind of dramatic or emotional or kind of personal sense, I suppose, I remember doing Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances with an orchestra, and their number 2 violinist had died 2 weeks before the rehearsal started.
Oh God!
That tune in the first movement that was quite something. So that sticks in my mind. I used to find, and this was something that helped me technically. When I was kind of starting out and doing amateur orchestras, I was the conductor of the Liverpool Mozart Orchestra for a number of years. So I did a lot of classical repertoire, and I used to well remember the feeling of just being knackered halfway through the finale of a Beethoven symphony, and getting over that and finding a way of pacing myself was a good lesson. It's the sort of, in physically, in a way, the sort of relentlessness of something like that is so much more difficult than a Mahler symphony, I think, from a physical perspective. Yeah,
absolutely true. I remember almost exactly the similar situation when I realized I have to do something about my conducting technique. And it was around the time that Zachary had suggested going to Jorma. The first time I conducted Walton 1 in a concert, I remember getting to the end of the first movement of Walton 1 in the concert and thinking, well, that's it. I'm knackered. How on earth am I going to get through the rest of this piece? And that's when I realized I've got to do something about this, because there's no way I can have a professional career, carry on conducting like this.
It's not a good feeling when you realize you've got nothing left, is it?
Exactly. And you've got 3 movements to go. I mean, that was the problem. The first half wasn't even that difficult. It was Malcolm Arnold dances and the Elgar Concerto. So it wasn't the first half that killed me. It was the first move to Walton 1. Yeah. When traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Probably some form of knowing where the best restaurants are.
Are you a trip advisory person or a book or a...
Yeah, I kind of used to be. I've probably gone off TripAdvisor a little bit. I probably try and sort of Google restaurant, newspaper restaurant reviews, or kind of Time Out magazines, weekend and wherever kind of type thing, or just talk to the locals. But yeah, always good to know where's good to eat, I think.
And is that something you tell your students, that the meal for one? Make sure you take a book with you, or an iPad. I mean, it does bring you back down to earth after a great day's rehearsal. You walk out, nobody talks to you. You go and have a meal for one. It brings you right back down to earth, doesn't it?
It does, but I don't know. I in a way I quite like that in a sense, but yeah, you're not there to party with the orchestra. That's the point.
No, exactly.
Yes, we're. I don't think I use it very often because it's now easier to get good coffee. But one of those apps that tells you where good coffee can be found is also quite helpful, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. Number 8. We're rattling through them. Anything you like, real or fantasy, serious or not. What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Probably the fact that lots of people in the orchestras that you conduct generally don't like conductors as a breed. And that's conductors to blame for that often.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, I've tried to get to the bottom of this because I was one of them. I joined an orchestra when I was basically 21, 22, didn't do anything about conducting until, I don't know, mid to late 20s. By the time I was 32, I really was starting to conduct amateur orchestras. And by the time I was 35, I was assistant conductor of the orchestra I was in. And so by then, in 13 years, my attitude had completely flipped. But I'm trying to work out really why this hatred. It can't all be down to the fact that, a conductor can earn more in one night than a player can earn in a month, can it? I mean, I suppose it's just down to a figure of authority. That's what it's down to.
Yeah, maybe
for some people.
I think it's just the feeling that often the conductor is not doing their job as well as the players are doing their job, and therefore there can be resentment for the fact that you're being paid 10 times more than the players are. And that's fair enough, I think, isn't it? But...
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I do remember one conductor saying to me, not on this podcast, just in a private conversation, there were times when he thought he conducted far worse than the orchestra played, but then there were other times when he thought he conducted far better than the orchestra played. And it can be like that sometimes. And the point is that we're all human beings, and therefore that can happen. But yeah, some people start from a standpoint of I hate you, you've got to convince me otherwise. Where many players now, and I think that the attitude has got so much better since I first started playing in 1991. More people are more open about conductors now.
Yep.
And are willing to give them longer than the walk from the door to the podium, which I knew some people who the minute they saw them, I don't like him. That was the case. But
yeah, and I think that's also probably because most of the people that are standing in front of orchestras at the beginning of their careers are probably just a bit better than they were 20 years ago. So that's there's a sort of basic level of competence. The education of conductors is a lot. It's a lot more comprehensive in a sense than it was 30 years ago, I think. So that probably helps.
It's very true, and you've got a lot of thanks to be taken for that being the case. Absolutely true. I agree with you. I totally agree with you. Number 9. Real or fantasy? If you wanted to be a captain of Scotland's football team, or a professional golfer, but what profession other than your own would you like to attempt, or have liked to have had a go at?
Probably professional sport in some sense. Now I play golf. I used to play cricket when I was young, even though I'm Scottish. I was very into sailing at one point, so it would have been professional sport of some kind, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It would have been what I'd like to do. Yeah.
Another one I can add to my fantasy list of getting a box at Lord's and inviting. I think I could probably fill a box of 10 now. We're going to have a day out. 10 conductors in a box watching cricket. That could be interesting.
What could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. Number 10. If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Probably, well, it'd be a toss-up between a Negroni and a Martini to start with.
Lovely.
And then it would be probably seafood of some kind, prawns or lobster or something like that, perhaps. Main course would be good beef, probably a rib of beef on the bone or something like that.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And a fine red.
Yeah.
Perhaps Rhone or Italian, perhaps, probably would be the thing. I'm not a massive. I'm fairly ambivalent about desserts, so I'd probably just be happy with that, and then drink the rest of the wine and maybe have a bit of cheese with it. So, yeah,
sounds very good to me. Though I have got a very sweet tooth, and I probably would have a pudding, and then go on to the port and the cheese and everything else. But that sounds wonderful. A cocktail, a fish course, a beef. Yeah, I'm with you. Absolutely with you. And talking of being with you, I really do seriously wish I could turn the clock back, because I think I would have loved to have gone and done 2 years masters in Manchester with you and studied conducting. I started way too late, but I wished I could have done that. And it's been fascinating listening to you talk about it. And I've learnt an awful lot, and I hope our listeners have too. So thank you, Mark. And I hope to speak to you again very soon.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a German conductor who went through the famous German Kapellmeister system, holding positions at 6 different theatres. She has subsequently gone on to become principal guest conductor of the Lahti Symphony Orchestra in Finland, and in 2021 she became chief conductor of the Residenti Orchestra in The Hague. But until then, bye-bye.